It had been almost 15 years since I last set foot in Ashford. The small, remote town in the Pacific Northwest was just a dot on the map, a forgotten place tucked away between dense forests and the jagged coastline. I left when I was 17, determined never to return. But when my older brother, David, called me out of the blue, something in his voice made me hesitate. There was an urgency to it, a kind of raw desperation I hadn't heard in years. He wasn't the kind of guy to ask for help. Not David. He was always the strong one, the reliable one. But the conversation was short, cryptic, and laced with something unsettling. "I need you here, Luke. Something's wrong. I can't explain it over the phone." That was all he said before hanging up. I should have ignored it, kept living my quiet life in Portland. But family is family, and David had practically raised me after our parents died when I was young. So I found myself driving north, back through the familiar winding roads, the towering fir trees casting long shadows over the asphalt, back to the place I swore I'd never see again. Ashford had always been a strange town. It thrived in the early 1900s as a logging community, but once the industry died, so did the town. By the time I was a teenager, half the houses were abandoned, windows boarded up, and streets overgrown with weeds. People were either too old to leave or too poor to care. But there was something else about Ashford. Something deeper. The town had a weight to it, a heaviness that you could feel as soon as you crossed the county line. It wasn't just the decay or the isolation. It was like the air itself was thicker, harder to breathe. As I drove into town, the sense of unease crept up on me like an old wound reopening. The town hadn't changed much. If anything, it looked worse. The main street was practically empty, save for a couple of rusted trucks and a stray dog nosing around a trash bin. The old diner where we used to hang out as kids was boarded up, the windows cracked and smeared with grime. The gas station had a faded sign flapping in the breeze, and the general store had a handwritten, closed sign in the window. But it wasn't just the dilapidation that bothered me. It was the silence. Ashford was always quiet, but this was different. The usual sounds of life, the distant hum of engines, birds chirping, wind rustling through trees, were absent. Felt like the town was holding its breath. David's house was on the outskirts, near the woods. It was a modest place, a single-story cabin he built himself after high school. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the front porch light flickering. It was late afternoon, but the clouds hung low and dark, casting the whole place in an early twilight. I stepped out of the car and paused, taking in the sight of the house. Something felt wrong. The door was ajar, just slightly, like someone had gone inside in a hurry. I called out David's name, but there was no answer. My heartbeat quickened as I walked up the steps, the wood creaking under my weight. Pushing the door open, I hesitated at the threshold. The inside of the house looked as I remembered it. Tidy, well-kept, but lived in. The kitchen table had a half-eaten sandwich and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. A jacket was thrown carelessly over the back of the couch, and the TV was on, its muted screen flickering with static. I called out again, louder this time, but the only response was the soft hum of the refrigerator. I moved through the house, checking each room. The bathroom was empty. The small office, untouched. The bedroom, that's where I found it. David's bed was made, but there was something on it, a photograph. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. It was an old picture of the two of us, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing by the lake just outside of town. We were smiling, arms slung over each other's shoulders, looking carefree. But something about the picture made my stomach turn. The background, the lake, looked wrong. The water, usually a deep blue, had a dark, almost oily sheen to it. And there, in the corner, something barely noticeable was a figure. Blurry, distant, but unmistakably human-shaped. I put the photo down, my heart racing. I didn't remember anyone being there that day. Suddenly, I heard a noise from outside, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I rushed to the front door and peered out into the gathering dusk. The woods loomed just beyond the backyard, their shadows stretching long and dark. I saw movement at the tree line, a figure standing still, almost blending into the dark. "David," I called, but I knew it wasn't him. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. I felt a chill crawl up my spine and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My mind raced. Who was that? What was that? And where the hell was David? I searched the house again, more frantically this time. The feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger with every passing second. I checked his phone, sitting on the kitchen counter, but there were no new messages, no clues, just that photo. As night fell, I paced the living room, my eyes darting to the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see that figure again. But the yard remained still, the woods beyond an impenetrable wall of black. The longer I sat in that house, the more I felt it. Something was watching me, not just from outside, but from everywhere, like the air itself was alive, pressing in on me. I needed to find David, or at least figure out what the hell was going on. The last time we spoke, he mentioned something about the lake, the same one from the photograph. Something had changed there, he said. Something he couldn't explain. I hadn't been to the lake since I was a kid, but I knew I'd have to go there. I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight, bracing myself for the cold October night. As I opened the door to leave, I glanced back at the photograph on the bed. The figure in the background seemed closer now, more defined, like it had moved while I wasn't looking. I slammed the door behind me, not daring to look back again. The path to the lake was one I knew well, even after all these years. As kids, David and I would ride our bikes along the narrow dirt trail that cut through the woods. It was always our go-to spot during the summers, a place to escape the monotony of small-town life, a place that once felt like freedom. Now, as I walked that same trail with only the beam of my flashlight to guide me, it felt like I was walking into something I should have stayed away from. The air was colder here, the thick canopy of trees above blotting out what little moonlight could break through the overcast sky. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, made me flinch. The sounds of the forest, once so familiar, now felt hostile. My footsteps seemed too loud, and the further I went, the more I felt the weight of being watched. Not like when someone glances your way, but something deeper, more invasive. As I walked, memories of my childhood trips to the lake replayed in my mind. There was always something a little eerie about the place. Sure, during the day, it was beautiful. Clear water, tall pines, the smell of fresh pine needles in the air. But at dusk, when the sun would sink behind the mountains, the place transformed. The shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and the lake's surface turned from blue to a deep, unnatural black. David always joked about it, saying the lake swallowed the light, but I never laughed. I always felt like there was something beneath the surface, something waiting. The trees thinned, and soon, I reached the edge of the lake. It looked exactly as I remembered, calm, still, but with that same oily, unnatural sheen. The moon, hidden behind thick clouds, didn't reflect on the water like it should have. Instead, the surface seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, as if the water itself was rejecting any attempt to illuminate it. I stood there, frozen at the water's edge, the flashlight trembling in my grip. That same oppressive feeling I'd had at David's house was here too, only stronger. The air was thick with it, making it hard to breathe. I looked around, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Only silence and the soft lapping of water against the shore. "David," I called out, my voice cracking in the cold air. The sound felt swallowed by the lake, dissipating into the stillness. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange along the shore. About 20 feet from where I stood, just at the edge of the water, there was a patch of disturbed earth. It looked like someone had dug into the rocky shoreline recently, and shallow, uneven footprints led to the water. The sight of it made my skin crawl. David must have been here. But why? And what was he digging for? I approached the disturbed earth cautiously, shining my flashlight over it. The hole wasn't deep, maybe a foot or so, but inside, something was half buried. I crouched down, my breath coming in short, anxious bursts. I moved some of the loose soil aside with my hands until I uncovered what was hidden underneath. It was a box, small and wooden, its surface worn smooth by time. The wood was dark and damp from being buried, and there were strange, faded symbols carved into it. Symbols I didn't recognize. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the lid. The rational part of me screamed to leave it alone, to walk away and never come back. But something compelled me to open it. I had to know. I pried the lid open, the wood creaking under the pressure, and inside was something I couldn't have expected. A collection of old photographs, yellowed and water-stained. I pulled them out one by one, my hands shaking. They were all of David and me as kids at different spots around town, at the lake in front of the old school, on the swings at the park. But in every single photo, there was that same blurry figure, lurking in the background, just out of focus. My stomach twisted as I flipped through them. The figure was always there, always in the same spot, never any closer or farther away. It was like it had been following us, watching us even then. The last photo in the stack was different. It was newer, the colors still vibrant, and it showed David standing alone by the lake. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, as if he had seen something behind the camera, something that had shocked him to his core. I turned the photo over, and scrawled in shaky handwriting on the back were the words, "It's not over." A rustling sound from behind me snapped me out of my daze. I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight frantically into the trees. Something moved just out of sight, barely visible through the dense undergrowth. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, the old photographs slipping from my fingers and scattering across the ground. Then, from the darkness, I heard it, a voice. It was low and garbled, like someone trying to speak underwater. My blood turned to ice as I realized the voice was saying my name. Luke. It was David. Or at least it sounded like David. But there was something wrong with it, something off about the way it pronounced the syllables, as if whoever or whatever was speaking hadn't used their voice in years. I stumbled back, the flashlight beam flickering wildly as I scanned the treeline. The voice came again, closer this time. Luke. My breath caught in my throat. The trees rustled again, and out of the darkness, I saw a figure step into the faint light of the flashlight. My heart nearly stopped. It was David. But it wasn't him. At least not anymore. The thing standing in front of me looked like my brother. His clothes, his face, his posture. It was all exactly the same. But the eyes were wrong. They were black, empty voids that seemed to absorb all light. And his skin was pale and waxy, like it had been stretched too tightly over his bones. "Luke," it rasped again, its mouth twitching unnaturally as it formed the words. I took another step back, my legs shaking, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the rocky shore. The flashlight rolled out of my hand, spinning away into the darkness. The thing that looked like David stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate. It reached out a hand, David's hand, but the fingers were long, too long, and twisted at unnatural angles. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen in place, my mind racing for some kind of explanation, but none came. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. Just as the thing reached me, the sky overhead rumbled with distant thunder, and a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the lake. In that split second, I saw it, the reflection of the thing in the water. But it wasn't David. It wasn't even human. It was something else entirely. For that brief moment, the lightning exposed the truth. What stood before me wasn't David. It had never been. Its reflection in the lake rippled, distorted, as if the surface was trying to reject the image. The thing was a twisted mockery of human form, with elongated limbs, unnaturally contorted. Its face, the same one I had thought belonged to my brother, melted away like liquid in the reflection, leaving only a featureless, shifting black mass where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. As soon as the light disappeared, so did the illusion. The darkness returned, and once again I saw David, or what I had thought was him. The thing took another slow step toward me, its head tilting to the side in a jerky, unnatural movement. My pulse raced, and I could feel my body trembling violently. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. "Luke," the voice gurgled again, a sickening mimicry of my brother's voice. But now that I'd seen its true form, I could hear the wrongness in it, the bubbling, gurgling sound underneath the words, like something was choking on water as it spoke. I scrambled backward, the jagged rocks of the shoreline digging painfully into my palms as I crawled. My mind was racing, unable to process what was happening. What the hell was that thing? Where was David? And what did it want with me? The thing's hand reached for me, fingers too long, too thin, closing the distance between us with an eerie calm. I felt a cold, suffocating presence wash over me as it drew closer, and for a moment, I thought I was going to black out. Then, suddenly, a deafening noise tore through the silence, the blaring sound of a car horn. The thing froze mid-step, its head snapping unnaturally toward the noise. My heart skipped as I realized someone was coming. The headlights of an old pickup truck cut through the trees, bouncing erratically over the uneven dirt road leading to the lake. The bright beams pierced the darkness, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of hope. The thing that looked like David hesitated for just a second longer, then melted back into the shadows, retreating into the forest like smoke dissipating into the wind. I stayed there, sprawled on the rocks, gasping for breath, until the truck screeched to a halt a few feet away from me. The door flew open, and a familiar figure rushed toward me, calling my name. It was an older man, his face lit briefly by the headlights as he ran toward me, panic etched in his features. "Luke, Jesus Christ, are you okay?" It was Alan Bracken, one of the few people in Ashford who hadn't left over the years. He'd known my family for as long as I could remember, always looked out for us after our parents died. He grabbed me by the shoulders, pulling me to my feet. I was shaking, the words stuck in my throat, and all I could do was point toward the treeline. Alan followed my gaze, scanning the dark woods. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "What the hell did you see out there?" I couldn't answer. How could I? What could I say? That something was pretending to be my brother? That I had seen something impossible? I shook my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "David," I finally managed to choke out. "I need to find David." Alan's face darkened, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "David's gone, Luke. He's been missing for days." "What?" I staggered back, the reality of his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. He called me. He said something was wrong. He said he needed me." Alan shook his head. "He didn't call you. I've been looking for him for the last 3 days. You didn't pick up your phone when I called earlier, so I came to find you. The last place anyone saw him was down here by the lake. But no one's seen him since." I stared at him in disbelief, my mind reeling. None of it made sense. If David hadn't called me, then who or what had? And if that thing at the lake wasn't him, then where was my brother? Alan grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the truck. "We need to get you out of here," he said firmly. "This place, it's not safe. Not after dark." "But what about David?" I stammered, glancing back at the lake. The reflection of the moon had returned, but the water was still black and lifeless, as if the thing that had been lurking there had left its mark. "We have to find him." "We will," Alan promised, though the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. "But not tonight. Not here." He pushed me into the passenger seat, and I sank into the worn leather, my heart still hammering in my chest. As Alan started the engine, I looked back at the shoreline one last time. The thing was gone, but the unease remained, lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Something about this place, this lake, was wrong, deeply wrong. And whatever had happened to David, it was connected to it. We drove in silence for a while, the truck bouncing over the uneven dirt road as we made our way back toward town. I stared out the window, the trees flashing by in the headlights, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. Alan kept glancing at me, concern etched into his lined face. "You were lucky I found you when I did," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I've seen people disappear down by that lake, Luke. Good people. They go missing and sometimes they come back. But they're not the same." I turned to him, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" Alan didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched. "The lake," he said quietly. "It's been like this for as long as I can remember. People don't talk about it because no one wants to believe it's real. But it's always been there, waiting. I've seen things in those woods, Luke. Things that shouldn't exist. And I've lost too many friends to whatever's out there." A chill ran down my spine as his words sank in. I thought back to the photos I had found in the box, the figure in the background, always there, always watching. Had it been following us all this time? Even when we were kids? "And David?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to him?" Alan sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't know. But I'll tell you this, if he's still out there, we need to be careful. Because if the lake has him, he's not the same anymore." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. I looked out the window, the dark outline of the trees blurring as we sped past. Somewhere out there, in the shadows, something was waiting. and I wasn't sure if I'd ever see my brother again. At least not the way he used to be. As we pulled back into town, Alan parked the truck in front of his place, a small, weathered house at the end of a dead-end street. He turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment before speaking again. "I don't know what you saw tonight," he said quietly, "but I do know one thing. Once the lake has you, it doesn't let go easily. Whatever's out there, it's old. Older than this town. And it doesn't forget." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? All I could think about was the lake, the thing that had looked like David, and the terrifying possibility that my brother was gone, truly gone, and something else had taken his place. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I had to go back to the lake. The next day dawned with an oppressive heaviness. I barely slept, haunted by nightmares of that thing from the lake, its eyes. No, the black voids where its eyes should have been, piercing through the darkness. Alan had offered me a bed at his place, but my mind wouldn't allow me to rest. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside the windows had my heart racing, convinced that something was lurking just beyond the walls. By morning, the fear had turned into determination. I had to go back to the lake. David was still out there somewhere, and I refused to believe that he was gone. Not completely. Whatever the lake had taken, I would take back. But I wasn't going to do it alone. Alan was waiting for me in the kitchen, sipping his coffee when I walked in. He looked like he hadn't slept either, dark circles under his eyes. When he saw the look on my face, he didn't need to ask. "You're going back, aren't you?" he said quietly, his voice tinged with the same dread I felt deep in my bones. I nodded. "I don't have a choice. David's still out there, Alan." "I know it." He set down his cup, sighing. "You're not going alone." There was no arguing with him. He knew what was out there better than anyone, and though part of me wanted to protect him from whatever awaited, I knew I couldn't do it by myself. We gathered what little gear we thought we'd need, flashlights, rope, and Alan's old hunting rifle. He loaded it with grim precision, the weight of the situation hanging heavy between us. The town was as lifeless as ever as we drove through the empty streets toward the lake. Alan hadn't told anyone about our plan, and I didn't blame him. Who would believe us? The place was cursed. People knew it, but no one dared to speak it aloud. There was an unspoken understanding that the lake wasn't to be messed with, that those who disappeared weren't coming back. But I couldn't let that happen to David. As we reached the dirt trail that led to the shore, the same unease from the previous night gripped me. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees leaning in like silent witnesses to something I wasn't supposed to see. We got out of the truck, the silence pressing down on us, broken only by the crunch of leaves under our boots. The lake came into view, and it was exactly as I had left it. Cold, black, and impossibly still. There was something wrong with the water. It looked unnatural, as if the surface wasn't just liquid but something alive, waiting. Alan and I stood at the edge, staring into its depths. He held the rifle close, his eyes scanning the treeline. "Do you think it'll come back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It never really left," he replied grimly. "It's always here, waiting." I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the water. "David," I called out, my voice echoing across the still surface. "David, if you can hear me, I'm here. Come back." Nothing. No response. Just the eerie silence, the suffocating stillness of the lake. I shouted again, my voice cracking with desperation. Alan looked at me with pity, but I wasn't ready to give up. Then, from the far side of the lake, there was movement. The water rippled, slow at first, then faster, like something was rising from beneath. I froze, my heart pounding as I watched the surface shift. A figure emerged, its silhouette barely visible in the mist that had started to roll in from the woods. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat as the shape became clearer. It was David, or at least it looked like David. He waded through the water, his movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his body, and his face. Oh God, his face was blank. His eyes, black and hollow, locked onto me as he stepped onto the shore. "David," I whispered, unable to move. Alan raised the rifle, his hands trembling. "Luke, that's not him." I couldn't accept it, couldn't let go. I took a step forward, reaching out as if touching him could make everything right again. "David, please. It's me. It's Luke." The thing wearing my brother's face twitched, its head tilting to the side in that same jerky, unnatural motion I had seen the night before. And then it spoke, its voice garbled and wet, like it was forcing the words through a mouthful of water. "Luke," it rasped. "Help me." The sound of that voice, so distorted yet familiar, sent a cold shock through me. But there was something else in those words. Something desperate, something real. I took another step forward, ignoring Alan's protests. The thing standing before me was David. It had to be. "I'm here," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm going to get you out." Before I could take another step, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, catching myself just before falling into the water. That's when I saw it. Something moving under the surface. The water churned violently, as if something massive was writhing just below. I backed away, my heart racing. "Luke!" Alan shouted, his voice sharp with panic. "Get back! Now!" I looked up, and the thing that had once been my brother was no longer standing. It was changing, its limbs elongating, twisting, growing too long and too thin. Its face melted away, replaced by that same featureless blackness I had glimpsed in the reflection. It lunged at me. Before I could react, the blast of Alan's rifle split the air. The creature let out a horrible, inhuman scream as the bullet tore through its chest. It staggered, its form unraveling, and for a moment, I saw David's face again, his eyes wide with terror. "Luke, help me," he whispered one last time, and then he was gone. The thing collapsed into the water, dissolving into the dark, oily surface. I fell to my knees, my body shaking with shock and grief. Alan rushed to my side, pulling me away from the edge of the lake, his grip firm and unyielding. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." I looked back at the water, expecting the thing to rise again, but the lake was still. The ripples had vanished, and the surface was as calm and lifeless as before. David was gone. I had lost him for good. We didn't speak on the way back to town. There was nothing left to say. The lake had taken David, and I knew deep down that there was no getting him back. Whatever had come out of that water wasn't my brother. Not anymore. ####epilogue. I left Ashford the next day. Alan stayed behind, but he promised me that he'd keep an eye on the lake, make sure no one else went near it. But we both knew it wouldn't end there. The lake had its secrets, and it would continue to take what it wanted. I've tried to move on since then, but the memory of that night haunts me. Sometimes, I still hear David's voice, calling to me from the depths. Late at night, I see him in my dreams, standing at the edge of the lake, his black eyes staring back at me, pleading for help I can never give. The lake is still there, waiting, just like it always has. And sometimes I wonder if it's waiting for me, because once the lake has touched you, it never really lets you go.